And we are live. Welcome. Welcome everyone to episode 3 of I Journeys. Really excited for this episode. It comes at a very timely moment, I think. We're living in a pretty intense moment in time, aren't we? I mean, a lot of things are happening in the world. I'm based here in the Netherlands, but I think there's a lot of movements, there's a lot of developments, there's a lot of things going on which I think impact us all on a global level. In recent weeks, I think most of us are obviously aware because it's been all over mainstream media everywhere. There's been, mass global protests sort of, stimulated or started by the death of George Floyd in the United States. But again, this movement has sort of grown, and a lot of questions are being asked about, what is the role of the police, other institutions, public services, how, questions around equality. So not just around race, but all types of, corruption. A lot of these questions sort of are now really at the forefront, I think, of media. So for me, I couldn't think of a better moment in time to bring a guest, which was on my list anyway, someone who I have a huge admiration for, and I think is a shining example of somebody who's working actively on the ground on anti-corruption, on making people's voices heard. She has a wealth of experience also outside of her current role. But yeah, our guest today is Nathalie Dijkman, which I will directly pull up. So Nathalie, it's wonderful to have you with us, joining from Kampala. Thanks for doing this. First of all, thank you so much for agreeing to be on the stream.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure, and I look forward to the conversation.
Awesome. Yeah, it's most of you listening in, some of you might, but you won't recognize necessarily the colors and the sort of decor behind Nathalie, but I recognize it very well. It is the Innovation Village in Kampala where you're joining us from, right, Nathalie?
That's correct. Yes, this is where our office is.
Yeah, awesome. And it's a place that I've visited a few times, a place which I find very inspiring, a lot of great sort of innovators, people working on really cool things, operating out of that space. So yeah, happy to have you joining from such a great spot. So you're back in the office now, sort of regularly, are you?
Yes, yeah. Well, of course, we're still keeping social distance and trying to do it responsibly. But yeah, it's been really nice to be going back to the office to have this kind of conducive environment to do our work. And we work in shifts with our team, so there's always a few people in office, but never everyone at the same time. But yeah, it's been really good to be coming back here and not be at home all the time.
Awesome. Yeah, no, I can imagine. So in Uganda, for those of us who might not be so aware of the situation, there's been a lockdown, right? And currently there's a curfew still in place? What types of restrictions are you having to deal with there?
Correct, yes. So the situation in Uganda has been, quite serious. Not so much in terms of the number of cases, because luckily we haven't had any deaths yet due to COVID-19. And we are currently at about, I think, around 500 or 600 cases here that were officially reported. But the government has taken really serious measures to prevent a spread from happening. So since about the end of third week of March, we've been in a total lockdown here in Uganda. The first weeks were absolutely restricted in terms of any movement, no cars, no public transport, curfew from 7 p.m. And it has been changing a little bit in the last few weeks. They couldn't keep these stringent measures for such a long time. So more recently, since 2 weeks, we've been able to get into our cars again, luckily. But we still have a curfew starting at 7 p.m. And big gatherings are forbidden, and there's social distancing measures, of course. So yeah, it's pretty serious though.
No, I can imagine, and especially I can imagine also the lockdown and sort of lack of economic activity in a place like Kampala and Uganda more broadly has huge implications for people, right? So
Yeah.
we'll definitely get into that, I think, because I know that you're doing a lot of work. But before we really start, sort of getting into the sort of topics and the real in-depth content, I really want to, because again, why I invite certain people onto this stream are people who I find inspiring, people who are doing really cool stuff. So I also wanted to kind of, for the listeners, to get to know you a little bit more as a person as well. So yeah, you're originally from the Netherlands, right? You're joining us from Kampala. How do you end up sort of running an organization in Kampala and sort of transitioning? How did this story come about?
Yeah, so I have a longer story and a shorter story, so I'll try to keep it fairly short. But so yeah, I'm Dutch. I'm Dutch Polish. Actually, my mother is Polish, so I'm very European, I would say. But I've always been very interested in human rights, and I'm also quite an entrepreneurial person. So I always had all these side gigs. Since the beginning of my career, I've been working on human rights issues, justice issues, and also trying to develop innovative solutions for the justice issues of our times. But at the same time, I've also always grown a big love for Africa. So the first time I came to the continent was in 2011. I was doing research in Burundi, also in East Africa. And ever since, my love for African culture has also developed. And I really felt this instant click with Uganda when I arrived here for the first time in 2016. It's a very warm and open culture, and people are very friendly, and it's just a beautiful place. So I kind of instantly fell in love with this country. But I also noticed the issues that are here that are very serious, and unfortunately, it's also still a very low-income country. So there's major issues in the justice system here, a lot of corruption. And in particular, one day when I was working here, I actually got robbed, and I went to a police station, and that's how I kind of got to interact with the police here myself. And I was just shocked by the conditions of that police station. Even though I was treated very nicely, I still had to wait for a very long time, and I saw a lot of people waiting for a long time and basically in despair almost. And I realized how inefficient the system was. And in particular, when I saw that some people wanted to give feedback or wanted to kind of have their opinion being heard about because they were not treated well at that station, they were kind of pointed out to this wooden box on the wall called the suggestion box. And it's this pretty old school system that we have across the African continent, where if you want to give your feedback on a public office or sometimes even on private services, you drop like a piece of paper with your suggestion or feedback in like this wooden box on the wall. And I asked the police at that station to kind of tell us like, how often do you even empty this box? And they basically said, oh yeah, you know, like maybe once a year. So I've realized like, okay, there's a really big gap here in presenting a citizen voice and a citizen feedback back to these stations directly, and then to really hear from an independent source how they're doing. So that's when the whole idea of SEMA started to develop. And at the time, I was still working for another organization called HIL, the Hague Institute for Innovation of Law. And they
maybe just to interrupt you for 1 second as you're saying that, as well as you mentioned HIL. One of our colleagues, former colleagues, also at HIL, I see is listening in, Sandra. So
Yay,
I think HIL. I can say, because I still work at HIL, that your legacy at HIL is very much felt, and yeah. So no, sorry, yeah. So you were working at HIL at the time, indeed. So that's actually how I first came to know a little bit about SEMA as well. I managed to, you introduced me basically to Kampala. I really relate to your sort of love of Africa. The welcome feeling and just the amazing friends that you have also in your circles, the amazing people that you have around you. So I can totally see why you would, really want, fall in love with this country. And also on the other side, what you're saying on the sort of injustice side. I mean, I've not, like yourself, sort of experienced it personally. Obviously at HIL and through other engagements, I hear about it, but I can imagine that must have been a very frustrating thing, and then enough to make you want to really do something about it. But so there you are, and you have this idea. How do you, because I know you have a brilliant team. I had the chance to briefly meet them, and the respect they have for you is so cool. I happened to be there on your birthday in Kampala when they surprised you, which is amazing. But yeah, how do you go about, as this Dutch lady, sort of being in Kampala with this mission to want to improve things? How do you go about finding people that believe in this and getting it off the ground?
Yeah, I think that's been like a big journey and a discovery for myself as well. And I have to say that it's always been a bit tricky for me as a foreigner to come in here and say, look, I have this idea, and now we just have to kind of fix this world according to my views of the world, which are very Western and European. And I don't think that's a really good way of development work or innovation. I really believe in bottom-up innovation and solutions. So I never really wanted to be that kind of boss or CEO or founder who kind of really imposes this idea and this way of working completely on how people do it locally. So our whole idea was really from the beginning to involve Ugandans in the solution of SEMA and in the development of SEMA. So I think one of the first things we did as founders was to get volunteers and people to join our movement and this idea, and to basically say, what do you think of this and how should we do this? And so like in March 2018, when we started, we basically started with a group of university students who were all like, this is cool, this is interesting. And they were about 10 people who were just genuinely interested in the idea of accountability of public services and citizen voice. And we just went into discussions with them, like, how would you go about it? And do you think people would even give feedback if they wanted to an independent platform? So they were the first ones who would go to these police stations and actually interview people and ask citizens, how is your experience here today? And do you want to give your feedback? And from the very beginning, these people have been kind of at the forefront of building SEMA. So I really don't want to take all the credit for what SEMA has achieved until now. And I think about four of those initial 10 volunteers are now core employees of SEMA who are driving SEMA every day and are really coming up with solutions, especially now during COVID-19, and coming up with new experiments like, let's try this, let's do this. So I really think that has been maybe one of our success stories, that our team has been so involved from the beginning in forming the solution that we're providing here to Ugandan society. And it made it much more kind of, sorry, I'm reading something funny.
No, everyone sees this, so these are comments that I see. So we have, and again, I actively encourage all our listeners to kind of step in, but you definitely know, and this is something that I think is hard. And obviously, you're a very humble person, so you don't say this, but I've seen, again, like sort of at that birthday thing, I've seen you around your team. This sort of just this amazing vibe that you all bring. And this energy that I've experienced, and it's incredible that in just 2 years, you've sort of made the transition from just having a startup idea to really having your solution. And I want to hear a bit more about that, but really having this at police stations, something that you really got off the ground. So I think this is really this is something that I think people will really appreciate. So so there you are, and again, so I understand. So you have this vision. You're trying to involve people from the beginning. You have this amazing team around you. Still, those are great ingredients, but how do you go about then still convincing the government and the police and the sort of public institutions to be on board with this idea? How did they receive, we want to sort of have a more transparent way of people being able to sort of say when you're wrong, or how did the institutions receive this?
Yeah, that's a very good question, Borja. I think, just to kind of get back to what you just said about how special that is to have this kind of feeling. I really believe SEMA is more like, the way I see SEMA, it's more of a movement rather than just a startup or an organization. And I think that movement is what lures people. They want to be part of this idea of, really changing how public services work, and really trying to kind of introduce this idea of having the citizen at the core of what a public service should be about, and not about, this government bureaucracy. And we have this cool tool where you can give feedback, right? It's not so much about us selling the device as it is about selling the idea of being part of changing government, really changing how government should think and operate. And I think that has really also helped us to kind of pitch our idea to the government, to get to your question, because you also want to present a new solution to your partners in a way that they see the benefit of it, and that it's not just going to be, another CSO or another organization that is kind of maybe just a whistleblower or a watchdog that comes in, because they have enough of those, and they are very important, like the big Transparency Internationals, the big organizations that are there to kind of watch these organizations perform better. But from the very beginning, we presented ourselves as partners of the government, partners of the police. And by building trust with them, they've been able to really embrace us. And in the beginning, it was really not easy, because they were like, who the hell are you? Why are you coming here with these devices? These people asking questions. So definitely the first year was all about convincing the police why this is important. And one way in which we did that is by delivering on our promise. We told them, we're coming here to collect data, and you're going to get the data in a month. And they were like, in a month, really? Because normally they would get a report in a year. But the next month, there we were with a report. And they were the first ones to see the report. We didn't post this report on social media or share it on our website. No, we gave it to them and told them, this is what citizens are telling about your service. What are you going to do about it? And they were like, well, okay, this is a cool report, So they kind of hung it on their wall, or they put it somewhere, but they really used it for their service improvement, because they were like, well, we've never been getting these kind of reports, right? So imagine this local police station in Kampala that has never really received data or information about their performance that quickly. Most of them have received reports about overall police performance, and then they never really feel like that's about them. But making things very personal has been at the key, I think one of our secret ingredients in getting them on our side. So really coming to them with the reports, discussing it with them, and not only shaming them. Whatever we write on those reports, there's always going to be some good information, because people are not motivated by, punishments. We know that from behavioral science, right? So you want to kind of highlight good performance. You want to tell them, this is what you're great at, but you need to work on these things as well. And because they were also proud of certain things, they started to see SEMA as a way for them to actually improve their image and to really do better and be more proud of their jobs. Because I really think a lot of police officers don't hate their jobs. They go into their jobs because they sometimes want to change the world. Many police officers feel like it's a community service they're doing. And they're not doing it for the money, definitely not in Uganda. So by them actually feeling proud of the work that they always dreamt to do is something that gives them a piece of their own identity back. And I think that's a win-win, both for citizens and for these police officers.
Yeah. No, that's so relevant again now, especially when I hear you say this now. That's exactly how I think most people feel in such a situation where the sort of role of police is being questioned, and people do understand that there are good people and bad people everywhere. And with my limited experience that I've had also sort of through Hill interacting with the Ugandan police force on a few different justice related issues, I was amazed by some of the individuals who I met. And indeed, I can definitely, and I've heard that, and I think it's very apparent that people obviously aren't in it for the money. I don't think, contrary to popular belief, they're in it for the power either, because I know from what I've heard and many of the stories that the living situations of police officers also in a city like Kampala, for them and their families is also very difficult. So I think that there's something that really, I think resonates with me about the way in which you bring forward the police's message. I mean, I attended one of your SEMA events in Kampala where you sat on a panel. I forget exactly who the gentleman was from the Ugandan police force, but it was incredible to hear from them directly, like you said, how proud they are of the achievements that they make, and also how valuable this data is. So maybe can you tell us a bit more? So you're collecting data, like what type of data are you collecting? And we can maybe focus, because actually one of the questions, maybe we can answer that first. So which sectors are you serving? We're talking quite a bit about the police. Is that sort of the main focus for you? Is it the police or are there other institutions?
So SEMA was developed to kind of help the government across the board. So, but we've piloted our services mostly with the police in the beginning and with municipality offices. So offices where people go for birth registrations or to get an ID or a certificate. So more like administrative things related, to government. But the police and municipality offices were the first offices where we worked with. And most recently, we've also been working with health centers, because those are now at the center of attention, and very important because we have a lot of public health facilities in Uganda that also need to be evaluated. But you could basically say that we could work at any government entity. And the way we collect the data, as you're just asking, is that we focus on data that comes from citizens, right? So we want to know what users of these public services think, and the users are the citizens. So we are basically a citizen feedback tool. So that's not a new concept, but the way we are trying to collect it is rather new, especially in the Ugandan context. So one way of collecting our data is that we place devices at these public offices. So at physical places where people access public services, we have smiley face devices that have like these nice smiley faces. You sometimes see them at airports. So we make those locally, and we place them at the exits of police stations. And you might be thinking like, whoa, who thinks of such a thing? But the reason why this works is because Uganda is a country that has people that speak over 44 different languages. So imagine building an online platform. How is that going to reach the illiterate? How is that going to reach, people who don't have smartphones, people who don't have the money to pay for internet bundles? So we really designed our model to fit for every citizen. So we don't want to kind of leave anyone behind, like the SDGs tell us. And that's how our system has been developed. Make it as easy as possible for any citizen to give feedback. So that's the devices themselves. But of course, that doesn't tell us why someone presses happy or sad, right? We don't know why a police station is then performing bad or good. So we also run surveys in different ways. We have mobile surveys that are automated. So we use USSD codes. That's the little *123* hash, the kind of system that we use, for instance, to top up our mobile money. That system we use for a SEMA survey, feedback survey. We also have a toll-free line, which is also kind of automated. So you can call this line and then it talks you through some of your feedback points that you might have for that station. But then most importantly, we also engage a group of student data collectors. So they are like surveyors who are standing at the exits of these offices in their SEMA t-shirts and with a tablet. And they basically interview anyone who leaves an office to just ask them, hey, how was it today? How was the service today? And they share their opinions. They talk about waiting times. They talk about corruption. And it's really very interesting data that comes out of those surveys because it tells us exactly how a particular police station can improve. Without that data, it would be very difficult to really give actionable recommendations to a station.
And so one of your main, so there's a couple of different sources of data, right? You have these, which you mentioned. So you guys actually manufacture these devices with the smiley faces. You guys as SEMA, so you work with the police in sort of partnership and doing all these things and collecting this data and writing up reports, but you also manufacture these devices yourselves. Is there a reason why you're manufacturing it and not buying them? I imagine that these are quite commonly available, right?
Yes, and that's a really good question. And I sometimes have to laugh at the idea that SEMA is manufacturing devices. And I know that Connor is also laughing when he hears this. But what it means is that, we in the beginning try to deploy existing devices because it's true. There's many manufacturers of such devices already in China, and the US, Europe. But the problem is they're expensive. They're expensive, even to ship them to Uganda, right? And then it's a subscription-based thing. So you don't buy a device, you buy a subscription. And if we are tied to service providers with subscriptions, then it's also going to raise the prices for our local market in Uganda, right? So it's not been a sustainable model for us to use other service providers. And we realized if we make these devices ourselves, we can position ourselves as the first East African feedback device production company. And that could be like a great way of us scaling up our services even to the private sector as well, and make it much cheaper for governments to even deploy our systems. Plus, yeah, I mean, who doesn't want to have a locally made device these days? I mean, Museveni, our president, the other day during like this very lengthy speech said that he wants to kind of stop importing products, which is of course a ridiculous thing to say, but I mean, in a way, he really, really wants Uganda to start producing more products themselves. And so this kind of focus on producing local products is real, and it will help us to scale much faster, and it will make our whole product much more localized, and will create employment opportunities here and really help Uganda on several fronts. So yeah, that's the reason.
That's really cool. So because I guess, I mean, there isn't, you know, to my understanding, and I always would have imagined indeed, and I guess you've gone through that journey trying to use, and you've given some really good reasons of why you then switched and decided, well, we're going to do this ourselves. But again, my question sort of is, how did you go about that? I mean, what type of manufacturing capacity was sort of already there for you to work with? And you know, not to, but is a lot of it sort of, let's say, is it more assembled there, or are a lot of the components really coming from you know, yeah, how much of the manufacturing is done locally?
Again, good question. Yeah, of course, we need to deal with the infrastructure that is here, right? So we can't produce stuff here that is simply not available here. So for instance, electronics, almost impossible to get those made here. So we still make our electronics in China or in the Netherlands, and then we ship them here. But then the assembly of the actual case around the electronics can easily be done here. We made wooden devices, metal devices, even plastics production. We're looking now into the next steps of our new device, going to be done with recycled plastics that are simply coming out of bottles here that are thrown away in Uganda, and we're using that to make our new cases. So there's a lot that can be done here. But yeah, I would say that the design phase, and especially the microchip that we developed, was developed with hardware technicians in Europe to eventually kind of ship them to Uganda. Unfortunately, that was still the step that we had to make, but I would say everything based on, you know, dashboard development, backend development, it's also done by our local IT guys. So it's really a mix. It's quite a global mix of production.
No, that's great to know, and I think it's also just again a really good example of you know, and like you said, I mean, you mentioned sort of Museveni, and in the Ugandan context, they want maybe more local production, but I think this is sort of a global movement right now, especially within the context of COVID. There's so many calls for, you know, why are we so reliant on other countries for manufacturing certain things that can be done here, and I think especially in the context of Africa. You have an incredible opportunity to increase sort of more locally produced things. So it's really great to see, you know, how incorporated you are sort of locally, and the different ways in which you're also following up on these iterations, because indeed I think that's a lot of you know, and I guess you get this question a lot. So okay, so you just have this device with smiley faces. How innovative is that really? But when I see the responses, so maybe tell us a bit more about the data that you get out of it. What does the data tell you? Are you, and maybe before you answer that as well, I'm curious, do you also collect any of the data on the type of person that's answering? For example, I mean, things on gender or age or anything like that, or is it just a sort of blanket question?
Yeah, so I think, like, just to get back to your point, like how innovative is it really what we're doing? And I just want to iterate what I said in the beginning. Like, I don't see SEMA necessarily as, you know, a company providing this product. It's a movement that we're part of. And I think the real innovative part of what we're doing is to introduce existing systems or existing tools that are out there, and introducing them in a public sector that has never been able to benefit from it. So that's the innovative part of it, delivering the data right directly to the police on a monthly basis, regularly. these devices have never been at police stations, so it's not so much about, wow, we're developing these devices ourselves. Yes, that's a great achievement, and I think it's going to make us sustainable, but it's not necessarily what makes us so innovative, as you say. But the data itself, yeah, it's really about the combination of the different data sources. So as I said, the device itself has interesting data, especially when you want to look at fluctuations during a day or a week, because we can see those presses in real time. But it doesn't tell us so much about, indeed, who's the citizen that's pressing, what do they really think about the service. So the qualitative data, the surveys are really, really needed in order to drive kind of change at these public offices. That's why we also never provide our services only based on the devices. We've got that question before from the justice sector to say like, hey, we just want your devices and it's fine. And we would just go back and say like, no, that's not what we're about. We're not just, okay, the devices are great, but we're not just going to deliver some devices to you and then have you manage that process, because we know it's not going to lead to real changes. So the real changes that come is actually the combination of the device data and the survey data. And the survey data does include demographic data. So the survey data tells us what's the gender of the citizen, what is their age group. So are they young or older, and which language they speak, for instance, which tells us a lot about, which background they have.
Because maybe for those of us, how many languages are spoken in Uganda?
44.
Wow.
44 languages, so it's a lot. And it depends a lot on the region. So currently we are only measuring around Kampala, which is in the Uganda region, district of Uganda, and the commonly spoken language here is Luganda. Aside from English, which everyone learns at school, but those that don't finish school don't speak English. So in the end, doing surveys only in English or communicating with citizens only in English is not going to bring out everyone. So that's kind of, and the data itself that we then gather through the surveys is much more qualitative. So it tells us about bribery, it tells us about waiting times, it tells us about friendliness of the staff. So there's all these different aspects of what a good service delivery is that is collected through the surveys that can really make the data much more interesting to a public office.
And this is mostly done at the station level, right? At each police station, you would have a separate set of data that you can sort of compare them between each other. One question that's coming in, and I had this sort of same question, like, do you see anything then from this, the demographic data, any specific sort of issues for women in Uganda?
It's funny that what we've seen is that the differences between how women and men rate services is not that large in Uganda. We do see that, generally speaking, women seem to be rating services a bit higher even, which is funny because it might have to do with a bias of just being more easily satisfied, maybe. So we don't know exactly why that is, but it's not the case that women generally experience services worse than men in Uganda. So that's, I think, a very positive thing. Another thing that we've been measuring on gender is the gender of the police officer. So what we've seen at some police stations is if you're helped as a citizen by a female police officer, you might rate that service higher or better, because female police officers tend to be nicer or friendlier, a bit more caring, maybe, and that helps for citizens to feel more understood and helped with their justice problems. So one of our recommendations last year to the police was to have more female officers deployed at the at the receptions of police stations, because it has increased their satisfaction rates.
Okay. Interesting. So you're mentioning already then that you do then provide, you don't just provide them with data, you also do then sort of interpret that data to some extent and provide recommendations.
Yeah, we are quite, I would say modest with those recommendations, because we prefer just giving the data and them interpreting it themselves. But we do realize our role as analysts is also to really seek out the trends and the issues that we see in the data and to highlight those. So this year we're experimenting a bit more with policy recommendations, especially because we've been, over the last 2 years, gathering data and presenting it monthly to each of the particular police stations. So for instance, police station A would get this recommendation, police station B would get this recommendation based on what citizens have told us. But now we are at the stage where after 2 years, we can look at, what are the common issues that are coming back at all these police stations that we can present to headquarters and to policymakers that they should address across the board. So that's what we're kind of in this phase, that's where we are now, is that we're really looking at the bigger trends and to really present that.
Yeah. And you're kind of talking about this, but so how regularly then are you collecting this data? Is this sort of is this done on a constant basis, and how often do you sort of review this and provide reports?
Yeah, so the whole point of the SEMA system is that it's constant. It's constant because we want any citizen to be able to give feedback whenever they've made use of a service. They shouldn't just be able to give feedback whenever SEMA is around, let's say. So yeah, that's a continuous thing. There should always be a continuous feedback flow from citizens into public services. But the analysis part and the review of the data is done on a monthly basis by us. So every month we really look at what data has come in and how can we present that back to each office. If the numbers are too low, we might skip a month, but generally speaking, we try to get enough feedback from citizens in order to give a monthly report, because if you don't give monthly reports, an officer will also not see how they can really improve, and they won't feel that, let's say, stick or carrot, whichever way you present it, to actually improve. Imagine a police officer only getting a report once a year. They would, after receiving their report, sit down for a year and then wait for the next year, right? But having this continuous influx of data reports that are very simple to navigate, it's just one page, basically, helps them to really understand, okay, this is how I've done compared to last month, and this is how I'm doing compared to other stations. So they also rate each other against other stations. And for that, you need continuous data flow.
Okay, interesting. So I get the impression then that a lot of these police stations are reviewing their own data regularly, even comparing it with other police stations. What types of actions are they taking? And do you see that now in the sort of 2 years of data? Do you see any changes coming back? Are there improvements being made in terms of the delivery of services and how citizens view the police?
Yeah, so I mean, of course, I want to paint like this perfect picture of the police improving constantly, but I don't think you would believe me if I would say that. So to give you the honest answer, there are I guess it's an open door or it's very obvious, but there are some stations or some champions within the police that really want to improve and that are actively improving. And you always also have those stations that don't seem to care so much. And in the end, it really comes down to the individual managers of these police stations to make the changes, to address their staff and so on. So what we've seen is that the way we're tracking our impact is that we're really looking at which stations are example stations and what can we learn, how can we focus on those stations that are actively making improvements, listening to the citizen feedback, waiting for next month's report, and seeing what improvements they're making. So for instance, one of the stations that we've been working with since March 2018 has made such tremendous improvements that they improved their satisfaction year over year with 20% increase, and the waiting time decreased, and corruption rates have decreased with 25% at that station, just because there were a lot of corruption cases that were, filtered through the SEMA system and that we addressed with them in their monthly reports. And they really, the OC that was in charge there, the officer in charge, was very dedicated to making his station an outstanding station. And he would communicate often with SEMA to hear what is the next data, what should we do. And it was a tool for him as a manager to really improve his station, and he could use those reports to his advantage, because after that he made promotion, and SEMA was able to award that station as a police station of the year. So they really got highlighted in the media, in the Ugandan media, as a best performing station. Those reports also went up to their bosses at headquarters, and because of those kind of achievements, it paid off. It paid off for that station, it paid off for the image, it paid off for that officer in charge. So you also see that it really helps if a station improves, because they can actually see they gain from it. And that's also very important. But yeah, I have to admit, there are also stations that have not really improved over time. And yeah, as much as we deliver reports to them, maybe they don't care. But yeah, it comes down to also their own self-image.
Okay. So it really comes down, and that's interesting again with the parallels of today's context. It seems to come down a lot of times also to the people who are in charge at the individual stations or individual divisions, those who are actually willing and able to make a difference. And I guess with this data that you provide, those who want to make a change can use it to make a change. But of course, those who maybe aren't willing to, it's very difficult to use data as an incentive. So, and it's interesting that you mentioned a carrot and stick approach as well, right? Because it seems like that there would be both an incentive to be better, but also maybe in comparison with other stations, or a fear also of being reprimanded, which I guess should arguably also exist, right? People should be willing and wanting to provide good services. Is this data sort of public then, in terms of how they're doing? Are the public able to access this data at any level, or your report?
Good question again. No, the short answer is no.
It wasn't even just my question.
No, because we wanted to create this this relationship of trust with the police. So we were delivering honest citizen feedback to them for them to make improvements, and in return we didn't make that data public because we didn't want them to feel shamed when they were not performing well. At the same time, for instance, when we announced our Station of the Year, we did announce that on social media. We made it very clear which stations are performing well, which ones are not performing well, but not on a monthly basis and not in a way of shaming stations. So right now, we're at the stage, as I already kind of shared, that we are trying to analyze more the policy level data of how all these stations are doing across the board. And that data is going to be presented in public-facing reports. So we're now working on a public-facing report that can be accessed by citizens, by CSOs, to really look at what are the trends that we see. But it will be more on a kind of like a higher level, because the real police individual level reports are sometimes so sensitive that it's kind of the trade-off that we made between being able to collect that data and being so close, working with the police, and at the same time not having that kind of watchdog effect, and not being in a position where we shout out all the data constantly, because SEMA, we don't believe that that's going to lead to the real changes that will benefit citizens.
Yeah. No, exactly. No, and it's interesting. Also, I think somewhat verified. I'm also curious. I was going to ask sort of in a similar way, but how confident are you in this data? Like, is there is there a risk that there may be police or other people sort of influencing how people vote, or do you see any risk of that?
Yeah, of course, that risk is real. It's really there. And we've developed our systems in a way that we're really trying to make sure that the data is as valid as possible. So the enumerators or student data collectors are trained extensively about ethics of research and anti-bribery, and making sure that they're even selected according to the standards and the values that SEMA holds of integrity and independence. But of course, you can never really rule out those kind of interferences with the data. We've tried to do as much as we can in checking it. We also fact check we do random checks on the data. We do mystery visits to, some of the stations where our data collectors are supposed to collect data. But in the end, it's always going to be a risk for any data collection company of how valid your data is. And I think the biggest task you have is to really be open about how the data is collected, and to show exactly which checks and balances you have in place to make sure the data is as valid as possible. So in our case, that's based on selection, training of our data enumerators, also the way you reward them and evaluate them. All these things are really focused on making the data as reliable as possible. I think for the devices, that's a bit different, because the devices can be pressed by anyone and we won't be able to see that. But we do have also, our technology filters out some of the bias in the data. So for instance, if someone presses like 5 times in a row, it's not going to capture that. It will only capture one press every 10 seconds. Or the fact that people or officers could press the device in the middle of the night. So those presses are also filtered out. So we have this backend system set up that automatically kind of detects fraud in data patterns. So that's also the way we're trying to kind of mitigate the risk of misuse of our devices.
Okay.
But yeah, in the end, it's always going to be a risk, I think.
Yeah, no, of course. No, it's like you said. I mean, I think not even unique to you or any day. I mean, it's a problem of any data collection company, right? But it sounds in your answer like this is something that is very much on your minds, and from the beginning, right? Like the quality of data is something that you're constantly trying to work on and make sure is it's your core business, right? And
Right.
speaking of that, so this is, I'd love to understand a bit more. So how do you make this work financially? What is your business model? How do you do you sell these to the police, these devices? Who actually pays for this data?
Right now, we're mostly funded by donors and philanthropists. So in that sense, we're like kind of more of a traditional development organization. You could call it like that. But we are transitioning into becoming more self-sustained, and that means that our vision is that within 2 years we want to be funded by government at least for 30% of our overall revenue and 10% by the private sector, so that our overall contributions coming from donors and philanthropists is not more than 60%. And I think that's very feasible because right now 20% of our revenue is funded by the government, which means that not necessarily the police directly is paying for our data, because that might also bias it, but the fact that, for instance, the justice sector or the Ministry of ICT of Uganda is paying for our systems because they see value in the fact that there's locally made feedback devices that can be deployed at different government entities. So it's still tax money that is being filtered through these ministries into our systems without it biasing the agenda of how we're presenting the data. And I think that's a very solid model, and it also creates ownership, because I don't believe that you can just introduce a system that's completely foreign funded and then assume that it's just going to be existing after those funds run out. So it's been very important to us to also get government buy-in, because the moment they start paying or contributing to our systems, they also start seeing the value and getting ownership over it and really thinking, wow, we now have to pay attention to this data. So we're really trying to also get them on board in financing us. And the private sector might be, another arm of SEMA that will develop, where maybe companies will also buy our devices and use them, so that we can get extra revenue. Let's say we are deployed at a bank, and for every deployment we do at a bank, we can also cover a police station in the same neighborhood. So that's more like looking at the CSR programs of bigger companies to support us.
Because in Uganda, and that's an interesting sort of angle, indeed. And I know I love this. I mean, it sounds like you're really from the beginning, and also I've kind of seen you a bit through this journey of through SEMA and how quickly you're evolving. And it's so encouraging also to hear that and that is, I think, a really salient point here, that the government is willing to pay for such services. I think that's a really important point, that this isn't another sort of development. And again, this is in the context of Uganda, where we've sort of looked. I've done some research a bit on justice related budgets, and they are quite limited. It's not that they're flowing in money which they can put to these types of initiatives. So I think that says a lot, and it's a very encouraging sign. And with regards to the private sector, I'm curious, like, it seems like you've thought about this, you're actively thinking, possibly, to what extent do these types of devices and this type of feedback, to what extent does it exist already? Like, if I go to a bank in Kampala, actually I've been, man, and I didn't notice any, are these devices available?
I think, so what we see in the market now is that there are devices that help, for instance, companies with queuing. So you would get into an MTN center, for instance, and you would say what service you're coming for, right, on the screen with kind of like a tablet kind of form of machine.
Sorry, remind us, what is an MTN service?
Okay, that's a mobile provider, a big telecom provider, MTN. Okay. Yeah. So that's where you get your SIM card, or get your, and it's one of the biggest companies, if not the biggest company in Uganda right now. So they have these service centers. So when you go there, you need to indicate at the beginning what service you're coming for, and then you get this little card, and it helps you number, so you will just see your number coming up, and that's when it's your turn. So these kind of systems exist, and they sometimes have rating systems integrated into their machines, but the problem is usually people don't go back to the device after they've used the service. They just walk out and go to their cars. So convincing people to actually go back to that kind of machine is more difficult. And what we see, I think the only place in Uganda where I've seen these kind of really simple press devices has been at the Entebbe airport. So when you're checking in, you see these like miniature devices, and you can just like rate your interaction with that counter. And yeah, they have them at the airport, so there's definitely a market for it. I've not been able to figure out who their provider is, but I know for a fact that they're being shipped from abroad. So I think we are new in the market as to really testing local production and making it much cheaper and easier to deliver this product to private sector partners. Yeah. So I think there's a big opportunity there.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think it's huge, and yeah, I think it's also, I mean, you know, in terms of, it seems to me at least that the service that you provide in terms of not just helping to collect, but also you know, interpret to some extent, and also, yeah, consult in a way, or advise people on what they can do with that data, is valuable, of course, and is being done in both public and private sector settings. I know, and I encourage, I mean, some of my listeners are people who are in sort of impact investing and especially interested in sort of financial inclusion. And straight away, I think of where you are now, sort of next to a branch of FINCA, which is a microfinance institution, you know, and there's many others, but yeah, I think there's so many opportunities. There's so many branches, and that's just banks, but there's so many places. And I've heard, I know that's something that a lot of the people who are out there in terms of investing in these microfinance institutions are constantly working on, is how do you improve the user friendliness and sort of the delivery of these services on the ground. So I think that's a huge market. And also, I mean, in terms of, you know, we're talking a bit about Uganda, but and I also have this question: are you planning on rolling this out to other countries in Africa?
Yes, definitely. So we are building a scalable model. So the idea is that we will replicate this in other countries. Because we are now based in Kampala, and where we have a core team, we want to kind of stay close to our base in the beginning, also because of similar companies, similar markets, similar people, and even languages in the region, in the East Africa region. So our scaling plan is to first expand in East Africa. We are looking at Rwanda as a particular case this year. Of course, the whole COVID-19 pandemic has made it a little bit more challenging for us, but we actually already were planning on running our first pilot in Rwanda in Q2 of this year. We're still preparing for that, but yeah, it might be a little bit more challenging now, but we're also looking at Kenya, maybe Tanzania as well. So there's a few countries in East Africa that we're looking at firstly. We got some interest from other parts of the world, but we realized that it might be more challenging for us to be starting in other countries if most of our team is based here, and if our systems are also developed for similar populations like here. But that doesn't rule out that we could start in another country. But yeah, we would need very strong partnerships for that.
Yeah. No, so exactly. It seems like for your model, the partnerships part is quite important, right? It seems like you could probably quite easily scale up the actual services that you provide and probably the products, you know, to a certain extent, and there'd be challenges, but I'm sure, but it seems like the partnerships part, is it almost like starting from scratch in each country that you start, or even at a smaller level? Is it more of a station by station kind of thing, or can you get the whole police force or other institutions involved?
Yeah, I think how we're doing it now in Rwanda is that the starting point is really having a high level government entry. That's like the first thing to start with. So if we have, for instance, in this case, we have a direct entry with the Minister of Justice in Rwanda, who showed interest in SEMA. That means that if he approves it and he delegates it to the head of the police, and the police runs with it, they will delegate it down so that we eventually just start with like 5 police stations in Rwanda. But if you don't have that high level entry, it's going to be hard later down the line, to really get them involved, and especially also on the financial part. I guess it can be different in some other countries, but I do think the government buy-in from the very beginning is essential for what we're trying to do.
Yeah, absolutely. No, yeah, exactly. So I think that's where, so that will in many ways define, right, which countries you start with. And I guess also part of your reason with sticking with East Africa for now, it seems like you want to have quite a sort of phased approach and not try to do too much at once,
exactly.
which seems, reasonable. Yeah.
Yeah.
And in terms of what are and I'm also mindful of the time. And what would you say are some of the main issues that come out of what you've been doing so far? If you could say sort of like top 5 or top 3 issues, and this is also a question from our audience members, but I also have this myself. What are key issues?
You mean key issues in terms of the service delivery improvements that citizens
Yeah,
are telling us,
that
or
citizens. What are citizens looking for? What are they looking for to be improved?
Yeah, so many citizens just want to be helped. It sounds very obvious, but most citizens in Uganda at least come to a station to fix something, and then they find out that, they're not being helped. They sometimes have to come back multiple times because they didn't bring this thing, or this officer is not in, so this whole bureaucratic maze of getting to just arrange something has been a huge setback for many citizens, and a very significant variable in predicting satisfaction at a police station. We were actually looking at this data this morning, like we did a regression analysis on our data, and we could see exactly which factors can influence satisfaction at police stations, for instance. And a negative factor is waiting time, and another negative factor is being sent around from department to department. So I guess those are quite obvious factors. The other issues that we see that have a very high influence on people's satisfaction is friendliness of staff. Just the mere idea of being taken care of, and this whole customer care culture that we know in the private sector hardly exists in the public sector. And you might be familiar with this, but I mean, I even know it in the Netherlands. So I guess it's not just an African thing, but like many civil servants don't necessarily feel that they really have to, treat citizens as customers. But that is again part of this movement that we're trying to start, which is, there needs to be customer care even at public services. And that's what many citizens say. Other issues are, of course, related to corruption and bribery. It's a big issue with the police, especially the traffic police in Uganda. Sometimes people also complain about waiting areas, like having nowhere to sit when they're waiting. It's a very simple thing, but at some stations is also very easy to fix. So yeah, I would say that those are some of the most common complaints and issues we're seeing.
No, and it's interesting also. And I guess that is quite unique to Uganda, but especially we have this assumption that especially bribery and corruption are things, that we don't deal with, let's say in the context at least of the Netherlands, or very rarely. Do you see any improvements over time in terms of corruption and bribery? Do we see any? Can you see that from the data yet, or is it too soon to tell?
We like to correlate our data as well with other data sources. So, for instance, we attended I closely monitor the other bribery indexes that are being published in East Africa in particular. So you have the East African Bribery Index. You also have the Corruption Perceptions Index that's published by Transparency International on an annual basis. Those are countrywide surveys. So they show perceptions of people of corruption, and we've seen in Uganda that we kind of slightly improved on the corruption barometer over the last year. I don't think we've seen that in the SEMA data, but I also have to admit that when we look at the SEMA data, that data is very difficult to interpret, because what we see, however well we train our enumerators, it's very difficult to get true data about corruption in general, because citizens, like, imagine you walking out of a station and you just bribed a police officer. Are you just going to tell this person who's interviewing you that you just bribed a police officer? Probably not, right? So many people aren't really honest about corruption. And what we also see is that corruption is so complex because many citizens offer to bribe. So it's not necessarily just the police officer who asks for a bribe, it's the citizen who offers a bribe. If you risk a fine of, let's say, $100, but you could also bribe this officer for $10, you might do that if $100 is almost your monthly income, right? So
supply and demand, right?
It's very complex. Corruption is such a complex thing that I prefer someone to kind of stay away from that. We really care about accountability, which is very important and highly related to corruption, but really measuring corruption and eradicating corruption at service level, yeah, I just think it's a very difficult topic to work on, and very complex, it just has so many layers in this society. The fact that the police is highly underpaid really adds to it. So, yeah, it's difficult. But as I explained, I mean, I already shared earlier the story of one police station really reducing corruption with 25% in 1 year has been incredible. And it was really thanks to their efforts of addressing this with their front end staff. But that was an exceptional case, I would say.
Yeah. No, that's and I think these are the kinds of stories that we need to hear more of, especially in these times.
Exactly.
Have sort of, it seems to me, at least in the Netherlands and other countries, that the sort of image of the police has in the last weeks somewhat also been influenced. Is that something that you feel is happening now in Uganda as well? Do you feel any impact of the current sort of movement against sort of police violence and stuff? Is that something that you're dealing with?
I think human rights watchers and defenders here are definitely paying more attention to it. There's been some attention to it from the civil society part, but I wouldn't say that the police itself feels very connected to the movement. I think they have other things on their mind. It's much more impactful what is happening with COVID-19 here in Uganda than what is happening around the Black Lives Matter movement. Just because, it has a more direct impact on people's lives and on people's jobs. So police officers are deployed at the streets because they need to enforce the lockdown measures, and they hate doing that job. So it just affects their work much more. I wouldn't say that they're so actively involved in what is happening globally, but human rights groups are. But what I do think is that, as SEMA, we are positioned internationally in a way, and then we're trying to really vouch for our solution everywhere. So I do think that we as an organization have a moral obligation to kind of take part in that discussion and to show what our successes have been with the police and how we can really use that for maybe other countries. I do think it's very relevant, but we've not seen it so much on the ground.
And so you mentioned the corona. So I imagine that has that influenced the image of the police in any way, having to enforce these lockdowns? I mean, in terms of the images of citizens of the police, they're the faces of this, right? So I imagine that they are the ones who get blamed for any measures.
Very much so. So, for instance, we're dealing with a country that has a very huge informal economy. So many people are dependent on, their daily income to even survive. So the moment you enforce a lockdown, many people are basically, in big trouble because they're not making their daily incomes. They don't have savings. So this issue has a lot to do with how people see the police, because the moment that they're kind of secretly opening up their shop because they really want to sell something that day, and the police comes to close them down, they are getting into this moral dilemma and conflict with each other, saying like, who are you? Why aren't you even seeing my side of the story? I'm starving here and you're closing my shop. And then the police is like, well, this is, enforcing the measures. This is orders from above, right? So you see that, and we see that in conversations with the police that, most of them are not in their police stations. They're on the streets nowadays, and they're forced to, enforce these measures that sometimes they don't agree with themselves. So they don't like their job so much anymore, or many of them are regretting it because they wanted to do good stuff for our citizens, and now 80% of their job is all at once enforcing things that they don't really want to enforce, or that leads them to be in conflict with citizens that they're actually wanting to protect. So that's been really disastrous for the police here. I have to say there's been some police brutality incidences as well, and a lot of citizens were scared by that. We've done an online survey on police experiences with citizens during the lockdown, and it showed much lower satisfaction rates that we're seeing normally at police stations, just because citizens have negative experiences with police on the streets because they just don't believe in the lockdown.
Yeah, exactly. No, and I can imagine that now then it's difficult to collect. Have you been able to collect any data from police stations themselves, from the actual devices?
It's starting to increase again, but for a while it was very low. Even though our devices were there with hand sanitizers attached to them, we didn't get so much input, sadly, because many people just didn't have any means to even reach a police station. So that's when we tried to test also online surveys and trying to do more mobile surveying, so not really being attached so much to the police stations themselves. But that, led to less responses and a sample that was much more biased because it was dependent on people being online. And it doesn't catch the same kind of group of people you want to really have their voice being heard.
Yeah, no, thinking of your earlier points also on, of course, especially in rural contexts and stuff, not everyone having access to smartphones and devices and being online, right? They're having to rely more on your use of USSD and other sort of technologies there.
Right.
Yeah, no, but it's good to hear that maybe as more people come back, that more data will be collected, and it's also great to know that you're still sort of finding ways to collect data during these times and tracking this. These very important developments, because I think this is, again, not even unique to Uganda in such a situation. I mean, just even out of common sense, it just seems, I can only imagine how difficult it is also for the police officers in such a situation to enforce such rules. So yeah, it must be a difficult situation, and hopefully, but you mentioned now already, like, that there's just curfews, right? That the things are sort of opening up slowly, and hopefully will be.
So it's already changing a little bit and improving, but it's a very difficult and challenging time, I think, and it highly impacts the relationship between citizens and police, I think.
Yes. Yeah. No, absolutely. And I think, again, your services probably become even more relevant now, as we need, within the coronavirus context, as we really also need, a better understanding of how our public services deliver what we need as citizens, right? So this is something that I think is relevant to us all. It's great that you're doing this in Uganda. It's even greater to hear, your plans to move beyond Uganda and to start doing this in other countries. I know that this is something, when I first asked you about this a while ago, it was something that we'll think about, but I hear much more, that you're coming and to a point where you're actively exploring it and really looking forward to seeing SEMA at more police stations, but also in different types of institutions. Because I think, again, this is something that really adds a lot of value to a lot of people. So I mean, thank you so much, Nathalie, for being with us today and sharing your story. The story definitely continues, so I look forward to sort of being in the loop. And definitely to all the listeners, I highly encourage you to follow Nathalie and SEMA on social media. They have a pretty active presence and release a lot of really cool videos and things, and really, I think, are very transparent also as an organization. So that keeps, it's an interesting one to follow. So I highly encourage that. Our listeners are also thanking you, Nathalie, for this discussion. I really enjoyed it. I think there's many more things we could discuss, but I really think this leaves a lot for us to think with, and I thank you not just for being here, but I thank you also for the work that you do.
Thank you so much, Borja. It was a pleasure. It was a nice conversation. And it's just great to have this talk with you and to share a bit more about what we do. And I'm glad we had some live listeners. It's just been a great format. So thank you so much for setting this up, Borja, and giving me the opportunity to share. And I think there's a lot of interesting topics to explore and to keep on exploring. So I'm looking forward to your next I&I journeys.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Nathalie. I appreciate it and look forward to catching up. Yes, and that's another episode wrapped. Next week we have a guest from Bangladesh, a friend of mine, Rafiqul Islam, who is CEO at Green Delta Capital and does basically a lot of sort of green investments in Bangladesh. I'll share more information with you on what these topics will be about, but it should be an interesting episode. I really enjoyed today's topic. I think it's, again, really so relevant in these times. I highly encourage all our listeners to really, support and check out what SEMA is doing. Really much looking forward to speaking with you in next episode. So thank you very much.